It's been a bit of a journey from starting up the PC and going through an AMD internals and caches RAM, and all this was done in the core boot, which came up with finally leading to its next stage, which is the payload. Then the payload was CBIOS. Then CBIOS loaded the GRUB as a core boot file system rather than loading it from the hard drive. And now we're ready for GRUB. GRUB is the part that accesses the disk and loads the Linux kernel and does all the different things from there. So let's see how far we can get in this video. I'm going to be going through the source code as support, as I have done on all the other videos, because to me, that shows what the software is instructing the computer to do. So I thought that would be the easiest way or the most convincing way to explain what's going on to myself and to you. I'm starting with a little overlap from the part 7 video, and I've got boot.c, not from grub, but this is from the C BIOS. And look at the comment, boot from a CBFS payload, a core boot file system payload. And that payload happens to be good old grub. Boot CBFS print booting from, so it puts a message out there, and then we do the CBFS run payload, which is in the coreboot.c file. CBFS run payload, and the option that actually runs the whole thing is payload segment entry, and it says calling address, and it goes to the destination. So from this point, we are actually starting to run the payload. So these two files, boot and core boot, aren't needed anymore because we're out of C BIOS. So I'm going to cancel those things out. Now I have startup. Oh, there's startup. And startup, the entry point traditionally for assembly is the underscore start symbol. So let's see how much is here. This does a compare to understand whether we're going to do a multi-boot or not. I think we want to do the multi-boot, but we'll get to that point. And then it says something about move to EBX external C start multi-boot info. Let's see if that actually occurs. Let's go down here, initialize the stack. Remember, we just barely started out. So here's the memory machine protect stack, and jump to the main body of C code. So this assembly is super short, obviously. So where is this thing? Well, it's in a file, not surprisingly, called main. And main, let's go back to the actual function name. It's grub main, not regular main, but grub main. So let's find that in the main file. Here's grub main. And this is really important. It says no return. So this is pretty much the whole thing. This loop here, or is it a loop? It's not really a loop, I think we'll find, but this describes all of the things that happen before we put the first thing on the screen that uh, well, we put stuff on the screen to what's going on. So grub machine init. We could go into those details, but you get lost unless you go through this overview. Grub boot time. This is a debug type arrangement here. After machine init, and then hello. Here we go with the message, welcome to grub. So this is the very first thing that you see on the screen. And notice it does a set color state. So we can actually control colors. So what does that mean? We're in a VGA terminal because we have the control of the colors. Then let's see, grub verifiers. Again, some housekeeping stuff to make everything work correctly. Grub load config. Now, before loading embedded modules, embedded modules are something I haven't looked at in great detail, but for this stage of this conversation, I don't see that that's going to slow us down any, or I don't want it to slow us down. Grub register exported symbols. Here's an architecture init linker. Oh, that's if def grub linker have init. So that has to do something with linking up everything up into a binary. Grub load modules after loading embedded modules. Keep going here. Set environment for root and prefix, reclaim space used for modules, reclaim module space. After reclaiming module space, again, the modules and so on, I'm not sure what the need for these actions are, but let's just keep going. Grub register core commands. So this is important. Remember, grub is a menu operated system. So let's see. Before execution of embedded config, load grub parser. Now, a parser is something that looks at the keystrokes that are entered and figures out what kind of message it is. So it parses through the commands that are given by the user through the keyboard. After execution of embedded config, grub load normal mode. Now this is ready to actually put the first screen or take the first action by grub. All this stuff was, like I said, housekeeping. Grub rescue run shouldn't happen. If everything is executed in normal mode, then you should never get to this point. So essentially, even though this was a never return function, once we go into normal mode, then we are being controlled by commands from the keyboard. Or we just let things time out and it goes ahead and loads Linux. There's the opening screen. And in the grub code, this is called the normal mode. The normal mode has the menus for all the different operating system versions that you might have. Now, if I hit the escape key, then I'll be right back to the uh, command line form, or I can hit C. I think C will work for me. Okay, there's the command line grub. And now I can do different things. One thing I can do is search for the Linux version to figure out which drive it's on. To figure out what my hardware devices are, I can do a list command, and let's see what that gives us. That gives us HD0, HD0 partition 3, HD0 partition 2, HD0 partition 1, and that's all it gives me. So all it's doing is just listing that I have access to the hard drive, and it's got different partitions that it might have. Now I'm issuing a list command for the files on on partition 2 of the hard drive 0. I already checked, and this one happens to have all the Linux kernel files that I might need. And this is normally on a boot sector. So you'll see that there are a lot of files here that I want to choose from. And let's see, the one that I want is buried in all that. What I do is search for the file that has the latest version, and also the version matches the top line or the default line on the normal mode screen. Now that I know that the file is on that partition 2 of hard drive 0, I can set the root to that value so that the Linux load command knows where to do things. There's the set root command. It's equal to HD0 GPT2. Let's go ahead and set that. Next step is to go ahead and load the Linux kernel. And that command is, there's the Linux command to load the Linux kernel. Once I've accomplished that, I can actually boot the system just by typing in boot. And we'll notice that it immediately starts spitting out messages. Apologies for the fuzzy screen, but I just wanted to show that Grub goes through these stages where it reads the boot sector for the different files, displays the files, and then when you select it or when it times out, it loads that file, and then it boots that file, and then the whole operating system starts up. Now, next, I'm going to go through the code that actually shows what's going on there. Earlier in the video, we showed some initialization and how we got to this command here where we execute the normal mode. In normal main.c, we find out that this is where we actually define the command normal. We want to do some configuration file name reading. And that's important because this system doesn't know what to put on the screen until it actually reads the boot EFI directory on the EFI sector. We have three choices of how we're going to exercise this function, grub enter normal mode, either with the config that we just talked about reading or not, one with a 0 and one with an argument. Now we're going to start the grub enter normal mode function. And one of the things we do is grub normal execute. So we better find out what that function's all about. Let's look at the comments for grub normal execute. read the config file, and if you go to the definition of config, it'll show you what the config file name is, and execute the menu interface or the command line interface if batch is false. So mainly we want to do the menu interface. Before we read the configuration file, we go through this process of reading lists. Here's the definition of the read list function. We read the command list, we read the file system list, we read something called a crypto list, and we read a terminal list. Here we're reading the file command.list for auto loading. So we're getting ready to start the whole thing up. Down here further, we have a grub file close. So we're opening and closing files. So that's on that EFI partition, which is designed specifically for this protocol. Let's return now to read. There's the read command list that we went to. Now let's read the file system list and see what we can learn from that. Notice we're coming up with the file name. And if the file name, then we must go through and load it. Let's see where we actually load it. Here we're opening the file. As you know, the steps are open the file, read the file, and then close the file. Let's see if we can find a place where the file is closed. There we go. We're closing the file. So this rounds out this part of it. I'm not going to go through the crypto list part of it. And let's see the terminal list. I'm also not going to go through that because we start losing our place. What's our place? What are we trying to do? We're reading enough information to populate the opening screen. We haven't even got to that point yet. Come all the way back to where we invoked the function read list, which was broken down into separate lists, configuration list, file system list. So let's see what else goes on here. Here, the little time stamp or the time entry here to keep track for debugging says executing config file. And then down here, we've executed the config file. So we've actually read some stuff in and we're starting to enter the menu. So grub show menu is our next step. Here we are, grub show menu, and that comes off. And one of the most important things it does here is it goes to another function. So let's see what's going on with that one. Now we're showing the menu, and one function leads to another, and we're finally at the point where we're going to run the menu. Here's the details of running the menu. If you can keep track of where we are, you can always back the video up and see what's going on. And it says get entry number, and notice it says the default entry. The default entry was the one right at the very top of the menu, which is the latest version of the Linux kernel. Now that we have the default entry, let's see what else goes on. Okay, here's the timeout information. So we're actually waiting for the 3 seconds to time out before we execute that top one. So if there are no interruptions by a keyboard command, then the thing finally times out. So that's where I'm headed on this one. Notice the return default entry. That means that we've timed out and it's time to see what happens with the default entry. Notice when we return the default entry, We put it into this variable called boot entry, which tells us really what to boot on. Now we're getting the entry, which is the default entry on the menu. I believe this command is grub clear screen. Then we do grub menu execute with fallback. Let's see what that thing is all about. We follow this down, we see grub menu execute entry, which that was the default entry that we've been talking about. Let's see where this heads us. We're running a menu entry now, and the thing I want to get to is something you've probably been looking forward to. If we go all the way down here, grub command execute and boot. So if we boot it, then the kernel has already been loaded, and now we're booting it Linux. So the next video, unless I miss my guess, is going to be Linux.